The people who are kind of leading the charge of what I would call demonizing Israel, maybe you would disagree with that term, are the same people who were demonizing the police. They were the same people who were demonizing America in the 1619 Project. And I just don't think that that's got much of a future, that hopefully that sentiment has run its course.
I'd like to ask Eli a question.
Yeah, sure.
I follow Peter Beinart. He's wringing his hands and fraught.
Yes.
I'm a colleague of Omer Bartov, the historian, who has announced that he thinks what Israel is perpetrating in Gaza amounts to genocide. He's an Israeli himself. I'm colleagues, not in the same institution, with two great economists, Ariel Rubinstein and Madi Perry, whose piece in Haaretz I happened to cross recently, which is also Beinart-esque in its hand-wringing about what's the atrocities, quote unquote, perpetrated by the IDF in the prosecution of the campaign in Gaza. And what I'm trying to ask about is the intra-Jewish conversation. If Matthew says that the war in its full effect will redound not to the interest of Israel in the long run, I assume a lot of that has to do with international opprobrium earned as a consequence of the conduct of the conflict by Israel. And the soul of the Jewish people, and forgive me, I'm not in a position to opine about that, but I know that people are opining about it, seems to be on the table here. And I just wonder how you would respond to that set of questions and those fellow Jewish intellectuals and journalists and academics who are wringing their hands in public and worried about the reputation of, if I may, your people.
Well, I mean, I would say that in the case of Peter Beinart, whose work I know the best, he began his career as a public intellectual as a Zionist, and I don't think he is a Zionist anymore. I think the majority of Jews in diaspora are Zionists. And I think it's fair to wring your hands after the war. I think it's fair to, I said this earlier, but I value, even though I disagree with where you're coming from on this question, I feel passionately about with Israel, I value someone as intelligent as yourself, exploring the other side. And in a sense, I suppose I kind of value Peter Beinart, although I have other issues with him. But I don't think it's really like I think it's a minority within diaspora that feels that way. And I'll cop to a prior. I think like many Jews in the world, October 7th was such a sort of bone-chilling event that I began to understand. I understood the war as a kind of an existential question. And I think that when you look at it like an existential war like that, and you realize that the survival of the safe haven for the Jewish people is on the line, which I think it was, I am willing to, in a situation like that, after you're attacked like that, to allow or to accept far more kind of harm to civilians than I would if it was just a sort of an abstract question. So, Peter Beinart and your colleague, Omer Bartov, I understand that they come at it from a different route. I do not think, though, that they really are speaking for that much of the broader Jewish diaspora. But at the same time, I will say that even on something I feel extremely passionate about and I disagree with them about, I'm grateful for intelligent people to make the arguments on the other side, because we all have our blind spots. So I hope that kind of makes sense. It's almost a Talmudic response. Is to say, I'm grateful for the dialectic, even though I very, very much disagree that there is something that the Jewish people or the Jewish state should feel ashamed of here.
It makes sense, but it leaves me with questions. One of them I've already asked, which is, at the end of the day, now that we are entering into some fashion or another of ceasefire, and Hamas is still standing, my God, the carnage that has been wrought, the destruction, the devastation that has been wrought, one has to ask, was it worth it somehow if we're back to square one?
I don't know that we're back to square one, though. I think you have to look at those other geopolitical factors. You have to look
about
at the
Iran
fact that
and Hezbollah and so on.
And also the leadership of the Sinwar is no more. Mohammed Deif is no more. The senior leadership of the people responsible for October 7th are gone.
But it's a festering wound that will presumably not go away and only reassert itself in the fullness of time, as has been the case in the past.
Perhaps.
The other question that I want to put to you, Eli, is as a distinction between American interest and Israel's interest on this issue of reputation. Israel's its existential conflict, it has to do what it has to do, and it's done it, and will take the hit. Would you see any credibility to an argument that, well, okay, that was Israel's hit, but that's not a hit necessarily that the United States has to take in terms of its geopolitical standing? And I mean, a little bit like asking allies to sign on to dropping Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. They might have said, you got to do what you got to do, but I would rather not have my name on it. What would you say to an American, perhaps someone like myself, who would concede the arguable necessity of Israel's actions, but nevertheless not want to be associated with them?
Well, I would say that one of the most important things in terms of America's reputation abroad is its alliances, and Israel is perceived as its ally. And I don't think there's any doubt that it's that the array of enemies that Israel was fighting were also despise America. So if the United States had restrained Israel, which I think is what you're getting at, or if the United States had said, okay, not in our name, we're not going to rearm you, and it had somehow hindered Israel's war efforts, I think that would be perceived. I think that would embolden America's enemies in the region. And I think it would cause doubts with other American allies that feel vulnerable to those same enemies. And I think it would have ripple effects. So I think it is in America's interest to have supported Israel. But let me just sort of, in the fairness to your point, the images, the civilian toll, the sort of moonscape that is now in Gaza, that is something that can engender opprobrium, of course, from all kinds of places in the world because we live in such a connected world. So I acknowledge that. But on this point, and again, this is kind of my speculation, and I'll acknowledge this is not based on data, based on a kind of sense of vibes that I love when you and John discuss kind of the moment we're in. Are we in a post-woke moment? I think what we saw on college campuses that began with kind of Hamas solidarity right after October 7th. So before Israel did anything, the statement from the Harvard postgraduate, whatever, the coalition of whoever they were, they said they hold Israel responsible for even October 7th. And this was the view of many on college campuses. Now, I see that sentiment as something that is very much, that is not a reflection of what I think most people in the West and most people in the United States think. And I also think that sentiment, and the intensity of the protests on campus that came right after October 7th, I think that is very much kind of coded right now in our culture with a lot of the same kind of woke issues that excited, this crowd on other issues, whether it was after George Floyd or whether, for that matter, it was like, the kind of extreme climate action. So in that respect, I'm not as worried about this lingering effect about Israel and its international and its reputation, because I think the people who are kind of leading the charge of what I would call demonizing Israel, maybe you would disagree with that term, are the same people who were demonizing the police. They were the same people who were kind of demonizing America in the 1619 Project. And I just don't think that's got much of a future. I think it's that hopefully that sentiment has run its course.
That is a comment about American politics with which I could substantially agree. It doesn't address the question of the global community as International Criminal Court.
Fair enough. Okay, so on the global community point, it's nothing new for Israel. It's been treated as a pariah by international institutions for almost its entire existence. And at the same time, that sense of being a pariah has not stopped normalization between Israel and Egypt and Jordan and the countries of the Abraham Accords. And if we are to believe Senator Rubio's testimony this week before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, soon possibly even Saudi Arabia, which if you would have told that to David Ben-Gurion and the founders of Israel, they would have fainted, it seems, because they couldn't believe that a country like Saudi Arabia, which is the heart of Islam and the heart of the Arab world, would ever get to a point where they could accept Israel's existence. And yet I think that's probably coming, in the aftermath of this. So on the one hand, you're right. There will always be a certain type, especially in international institutions, especially within the kind of UN bureaucracy. There will always be kind of an NGO crowd that will find Israel to be demonic. On the other hand, that has not stopped this kind of march towards normalization.